Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Okay. Since I'm holding an official position with the government of Israel, let me repeat and make clear that I'm presenting to you the results of my own research, and it does not reflect in any way, shape, or form the attitudes or the ideas of the government of Israel. Now, I was very lucky to be offered to be the last and the concluding speaker, since I'm taking whatever has been said so far in my session and actually in the previous sessions, and I would like to present to you what I call a macro assessment. When I got into studying the Saudi royal court, that happened almost 50 years ago, the question was not, is the Saudi kingdom going to collapse? That was not the question. The question was, when will it collapse and how much wealth would the princes take with them in their retirement fund in Geneva or in Zurich or in any other nice place, or in the Bahamas, who knows. I believe that today, almost 50 years later, the picture is much more complicated. But this is on the one hand. On the other hand, I believe that it is much more clear-cut. But before getting into the details of what I'm about to present to you, let me call your attention to one interesting fact. When we look at the Arab countries, Middle East, North Africa, one by one, we see that only republics collapsed or changed their nature or disappeared as we used to know them. For all practical purposes, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya do not exist anymore as they used to exist in the past as one territorial integrity, not anymore. And yet, when we look at the Arab principalities and kingdoms, no one, no ruler, no one has been touched by the Middle East turmoil. Yes, there have been changes in the regimes, all of them within the precedents. Yes, there have been several riots, but at times, like in Bahrain, with Saudi help, they were brought down. But basically, if there is one conclusion, clear conclusion that we can draw from the so-called Arab Spring, is that the Arab kingdoms so far have survived. And question is, how come? And will that continue for the future? Now, it is very interesting to talk about Saudi politics these days, because the rule that I'm making, and an article on that is about to be published next month, the rule is very clear. Whatever we have known on Saudi politics so far does not exist anymore. The Saudis are writing their history from page 1 all over again. And if you'll see at the headline there, I'm calling the period that Saudi Arabia is undergoing these days the interregnum, the time between reigns, the time between kings, because it is very clear that the ailing king does not run the kingdom. Of course, he meets with foreign dignitaries, and he does whatever he must do under protocols, royal protocols, but basically, as already has been mentioned, Mohammed bin Salman is running the country. In my writings, I nickname him the regent. This is exactly what he is doing these days. Now, when we look at the way that he took over the Saudi system, there have been several ways in which he has done it. But basically, he has never ignored the internal rules of the House of Saud. In other words, on the one hand, he did imprison all of his potential contenders, potential rivals, no question. All of them ended up in jail. Some of them paid some ransom money, like that poor, quote unquote, Al-Walid ibn Talal, one of the richest persons on earth. He had to pay a penalty of 120 billion US. 100 billion US. I cannot comprehend the meaning of that number. But this is what he had to pay to the treasury of Saudi Arabia to be released of his jail. By the way, at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Riyadh. That was his prison. Other potential contenders are still in prison. Some of the potential contenders met their deaths under unclear circumstances. A mysterious helicopter crash in southern Saudi Arabia, for instance. Another prince, a major contender, was on his way to Iran when he was apprehended, and in the gunfire that erupted, was killed. Interesting. That guy, by the way, was born 1972. He was the son of King Fahd, and he was the #1 contender against Mohammed bin Salman. In other words, this is on, let me say, on the side that we do not like. On the other hand, he, that is Mohammed bin Salman, nominated to leading positions brothers of those potential contenders that had been skipped for various reasons. In other words, he made sure that the family would not back those guys, and that the family, knowing their share in the coming government, in next government, would participate, even at time enthusiastically, participate in the new system. In other words, the domestic coalition is working very well. I will get to that coalition in a few minutes. Now, when we look at the making of foreign policy and putting together the position of a country within the family of nations, we have to understand that in order to do that in an efficient way, you must have a strong coalition at home. And as I already explained, there is a strong coalition at home. This is what we call level 1 coalition, the domestic coalition. Level 2 coalition is the coalition with nations all over the world that would make Saudi Arabia or any other country strong enough to assert its views on the international arena. All that, of course, is on the positive side. I will get to the negative in a few minutes. So when we look at the foreign relations of Saudi Arabia, even though they did not really like, to put it mildly, the positions of President Obama, today they're thanking him. Why? Because he forced them, against their will, against their tradition, against their history, to become a non-aligned nation. And in a few days, Saudi Arabia is going to sign a major arms deal with the Russians for the supply of ground-to-air S-400 missiles, the most advanced. As an Israeli, I like very much that idea, and I will explain in a minute why. In any case, Saudi Arabia today is a totally non-aligned country, and that country is relieved of many of its obligations, moral obligations, that is, to the United States. One of the reasons that President Trump went to Saudi Arabia first was in order to get them back to the right camp. And by the way, they are in the right camp, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, to relate to something that has already been raised here, and this is the reforms of Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman set a date, and the date is 2030. 2030 is 12 years from today. By that time, whatever he does or does not do, I believe that he hopes that he would already be very well entrenched in his position as the king of Saudi Arabia. So the test would come far away from today. So Vision 2030 is a major plan to change the situation of Saudi Arabia, to bring education, science, technology, to make Saudis feeling that they have a stake in the existence of the current regime. And all that brings us to the other side of the equation, to the risks and challenges. Because when we look at the makeup of the Saudi population, about 1/2 of them are foreigners, are not Saudis. Moreover, and I know that I'm going to shake some of the beliefs of most people, Saudi Arabia is a poor country. It is not the rich country that we used to relate to in previous years. Not at all. The GDP per capita of Saudi Arabia today, according to many calculations, not all of them, is less than that of the State of Israel. And as we all know, we don't have oil. Oh yeah, we do have gas, I forgot. But we do not have the income yet from gas. So Saudi Arabia today, instead of giving money, is begging for money. And they need the money in order to make sure that everyone has a stake in the kingdom, as I have already mentioned. However, in spite of their financial situation, the Saudis, for the first time ever, have a feeling that for us Israelis is not new at all. They feel being besieged. They feel like being surrounded by enemies. So when you read and watch Saudi media, you're getting a very strange feeling, and I'm talking 2017, 2018. Because when you opened Saudi media, let's say 1975, 1985, etc., you had the feeling that all is fine and that our king is doing his best and he's very successful. This is not what the Saudi media is projecting these days. They are projecting the issue of isolation. They are projecting the issue of we have a major enemy and we need to forge coalitions with whoever would like to be a part of our coalition, which from an Israeli point of view is, again, something very familiar. And therefore, I am not surprised at all that rumors are surfacing from time to time about Saudi cooperation with Israel. I don't know if this is true or not. What I do know is that for the first time ever, the Saudis are in a position to look for help anywhere and wherever they can get it, from Russia to China to whoever would extend them a hand. And it is not that easy for the Saudis these days not only to finance the life of commoners in Saudi Arabia. There was a time in which it was really fun to be a Saudi graduate student in the US, with whom I met many times in the US. They had their home leave 3-4 times a year. all expenses paid by the government. Not anymore. Not anymore, at least not to that extent. And why? Because the oil market has changed. And this is, don't forget, a one-product economy. And therefore, if the price of a barrel is less than $80 to $100, they are in deep trouble because they cannot finance their development plans. And as we all know, the price has been for, I believe, a couple of years, 3 years, around $50 to $60 a barrel. More than that. More than that. There are two new players on the oil market, Iraq and Iran. Well, not really new, but they're trying to get back to the levels of production and exports that they used to have prior to sanctions on Iran and prior to 2003 on Iraq. Moreover, Russia and at times the United States have already exceeded the Saudi production. In other words, their power to be a pivotal player in the oil market has evaporated. And therefore, they cannot dictate prices anymore, a major change from what it used to be. Still, they are the leading oil exporter, but the Russians can at will raise the levels of export if they want to. In other words, they still have resources to do whatever they wish, but it is much less than it used to be in the past. Now, why has all of that happened? First, Iran. The obvious response is Iran. And when we say Iran, this is not only that entity that we know by the name of Iran to the east of Iraq. This is Yemen, this is Hezbollah, this is Lebanon, this is Syria. All of that is Iran in this context. And what happened there was a major shift in the power balance in the Gulf before and after 2003. Before 2003, Saudi Arabia did not present any threat to any country. It was the weak player in the Gulf, and two strong players, Iran and Iraq, were competing with each other for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf principalities. And the power of Saudi Arabia at that time was that it was too weak, and the constant draw between the two stronger powers enabled it to develop according to its own pace. But not anymore, because after 2003, Iraq, as we knew it, stopped to exist, ceased to exist. This is not Iraq of Saddam Hussein, obviously. And therefore, Saudi Arabia was catapulted into a situation in which it is supposed to compete with Iran over the hegemony in the Persian Gulf. And as it has already presented here, Saudi Arabia cannot compete with Iran for a variety of reasons. And therefore, this is perhaps the major infrastructural reason that Saudi Arabia today has to fight for its own very existence as an entity. I was about to say a national entity. I will not say that. This is the topic of my next book, if this is a national Saudi or not. And since I have already been reminded that my time is almost up, 2, 3 more short points. One, Mohammed bin Salman dramatically changed the makeup of the cabinet structure. Today, the share of the commoners, 77% out of the 30 ministers. 6% are Saudi royals. This has never happened before. Usually, the royals had 50%, 51% of representation in the cabinet. Today, this is a government of commoners. And, as I said, this is a very short comment. And let me conclude, since this is an assessment, how do I assess the chances for a dramatic change in Saudi Arabia? Minimal. I think that Saudi Arabia, as we know it, as it is emerging today under Mohammed bin Salman, as I said, this is a new Saudi Arabia, the way I read the current situation is that it is going to continue along similar ways, with or without Mohammed bin Salman, for the foreseeable future. However, there are two conditions for that to happen. One, that Saudi Arabia would continue to be one of the building blocks of the moderate axis in the Middle East. I would say moderate, I would not say Sunni, I would not say anything else. And finally, refraining at any costs from intervening in Syria or in Lebanon, because that would only add to their problems with the Shiites, with Yemen, with Iran, etc. Bottom line, we are witnessing dramatic changes within Saudi Arabia, but indeed Saudi Arabia today has very good chances of surviving those changes. Thank you.